welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be exploring, well, some pretty potent ideas about global power dynamics from an article by Jacksonville University professor Jorge Majfud, published in the Latin American media.
Interesting.
And we're going to be unpacking his critique of the alpha male complex and its influence on colonization. As well as his challenge to the concept of the West.
I think what's fascinating here is how Majfud connects this alpha male complex, this relentless pursuit of dominance, directly to the history of colonization, especially by Europe and the U.S.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
Sure.
What exactly does Majfud mean by this alpha male complex?
Right.
And how does he tie it to colonization? I have to admit it's a term that definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah, it does. He defines it as, well, it's an aggressive need to dominate.
Okay.
Which he argues has fueled the brutal colonization we've seen since the 15th century. And he's not just talking about military conquest here.
Right.
Majfud points to the destruction of sophisticated pre-existing markets.
Okay.
He specifically mentions India, Bangladesh, and China.
Interesting.
As evidence that colonizers were intent on imposing their own economic systems, often through force.
So it's about dismantling existing structures and replacing them with a Western model.
Precisely.
Okay.
Majfud argues that this alpha male complex goes beyond wanting to conquer. It seeks to reshape the entire world.
Right.
In the image of the colonizer.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
He even uses the term psychic Occidentalism, right?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So it's the belief in the inherent superiority of Western values and the perceived need or even duty to impose them on the rest of the world.
Okay.
It's this belief that fuels the drive to, civilize other cultures, often at a terrible cost.
It's like saying, our way is the only right way, and we're going to make sure everyone else conforms.
Exactly.
We can see how that kind of thinking would lead to some serious problems throughout history.
Yeah.
And Majfud doesn't stop there. He goes on to challenge this whole notion of a unified West.
Right.
He calls it a fictional fallacy, which seems pretty bold.
Yeah.
Why does he believe that this concept is so misleading?
Well, Majfud argues that this idea of the West as this monolithic entity, a single tribe with shared values and goals, is a dangerous oversimplification.
Okay.
It ignores the incredible diversity within those categorized as Western, and it creates a false sense of unity that's often used to justify all sorts of actions.
It's creating an us versus them narrative, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Majfud points out that this kind of tribal thinking has been used to justify violence and oppression throughout history. Remember that quote from the article, the one about, how the tribal mind needs allies and enemies?
Yes.
It leads to these overly simplistic narratives that ignore nuance and complexity.
And this isn't just ancient history. We see this happening today with the way China is being portrayed as a threat to Western interests.
Absolutely.
Right.
China's economic and technological rise is frequently framed as a challenge to, Western dominance, which feeds into this narrative of an inevitable clash between two opposing forces.
So we've got this historical context of colonization driven by this alpha male complex.
Right.
This idea of a monolithic West that's used to justify all sorts of things. But where does AI-powered warfare fit into all of this?
Well, Majfud brings up Palantir Technologies, a data analytics company with deep ties to the U.S. government and military.
Right.
And what's really striking is the way some Palantir executives talk about the world. It aligns perfectly with this alpha male complex that we've been discussing.
And I remember reading those quotes. They were pretty chilling.
Yeah.
It's like they see global conflict as inevitable.
Right.
And victory as the only acceptable outcome.
Yes, their worldview is very stark.
Yeah.
One executive, Jacob Hellberg, talks about defending the West and the need to outcompete China. Another, Peter Thiel, goes even further, talking about screwing our enemies. They see the world in very black and white terms.
And Palantir isn't just talking about these ideas. They're building the technology to make them a reality.
Yeah.
Their AI is being used in actual conflicts right now, like in Ukraine and Palestine.
Right.
The ethical implications are huge.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The use of AI in warfare raises a whole host of questions that we haven't even begun to answer as a society.
Right.
And the potential for things to escalate quickly is very real.
It's like we're taking this age-old pursuit of power and giving it a technological upgrade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous combination, especially when you consider the potential for AI to remove humans from the decision-making process entirely.
So Mahfoud sees this historical context of colonization, the myth of a unified West,
Right.
and the rise of AI-powered warfare as all being intertwined, driven by this underlying alpha male complex.
Yes, he's arguing that this drive for dominance to be the alpha is still very much alive and well.
Right.
And it's finding new and potentially more destructive expression in the development and deployment of AI weaponry.
It makes you wonder, if this drive for dominance is so deeply ingrained, can we even break free from it? Is there another way forward?
That's the question Mahfoud is asking us to grapple with.
Yeah.
He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does suggest that we need to start imagining a plan B.
A plan B for global relations.
Yeah.
What would that even look like?
Well, that's something we can explore further in our next segment.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand just how deeply embedded this alpha male complex is in current power structures before we dig into Plan B.
Right before we were talking about Palantir and their rather unsettling worldview.
And what's really concerning is that this ideology, this
Yeah.
idea that conflict is inevitable and victory is the only acceptable outcome, seems to be gaining traction within the U.S. government. There are close ties between Palantir and high-ranking officials.
Okay.
For example, Congressman Mike Gallagher actually worked for Palantir before entering politics.
And it was Gallagher who wrote that article for Foreign Affairs, wasn't it? The one that argued that the U.S. needs to win, not just manage, its competition with China.
Exactly, and he's not alone.
Right.
There's a growing chorus in Washington pushing for a more aggressive stance towards China, framing it as an existential threat to the West.
It's almost as if they're trying to create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
The more they talk about China as an enemy, the more likely a conflict becomes.
And this is where the alpha male complex comes back into play.
Right.
This need to assert dominance, to be the top dog, can lead to reckless decision-making and escalate tensions unnecessarily.
It's like they're trapped in a zero-sum game, unable to imagine a world where the U.S. and China can coexist peacefully and prosper together.
Mahfoud argues that this mindset is incredibly dangerous.
Right.
It shuts down opportunities for diplomacy and cooperation, potentially leading us down a path toward a truly devastating conflict.
He even suggests that the U.S. might be shifting its focus from dollar dominance, which refers to the global reliance on the U.S. dollar for trade and finance, to AI-powered warfare as a way to maintain its global hegemony.
Yes, and that's a terrifying thought.
It is.
We've already seen how AI is being used in places like Ukraine and Palestine.
Right.
The potential for those situations to spiral out of control is immense.
Yeah.
Especially with Palantir essentially field testing their technology in these conflicts.
It's almost like history is repeating itself, but with a high-tech twist. Mahfoud even draws parallels to the Opium Wars in 19th century China.
That's right. Western powers used their military superiority to force China to open its markets, even though it was against their will. It was all about asserting dominance and control.
Right.
And while the context is different, the underlying drive for power remains the same, except this time the weapons are far more destructive.
It's a sobering thought. So if Mahfoud is right, and this alpha male complex is pushing us towards a potential World War III, what can we even do? It feels like such a massive problem. Where do we even begin?
It is a massive problem, but I don't think we should give in to despair.
Okay.
Mahfoud himself calls for us to envision a plan B, a way to resist these dangerous forces and build a more peaceful and equitable world. He doesn't lay out a detailed roadmap, but he does offer some starting points.
Okay, so what are some of the key elements of this plan B?
I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
We need to be critical of the narratives we're being fed, especially by those in power. We need to question the assumptions behind the us versus them mentality and look for common ground instead of focusing on differences.
So instead of buying into this idea of a monolithic West or a monolithic China, we need to recognize the diversity within these groups and look for opportunities to cooperate.
Exactly. We need to remember that we're all human beings sharing this planet, and our fates are intertwined.
It's a powerful message. We can't just rely on our leaders to do this work.
Yeah.
It starts with each of us, right?
Absolutely. It's about changing the way we interact with each other, how we consume information, and how we engage with the world.
Yeah.
We need to actively work towards building a more just and equitable world.
It's about choosing a different path, one that leads toward cooperation and a shared future. This is heavy stuff, but incredibly important.
Yeah.
What else does Mahfud suggest?
Well, in addition to shifting our mindset,
Yep,
he also highlights the importance of understanding the limitations of relying solely on high-tech solutions.
Right before we touched on his observations about the effectiveness of low-tech tactics against high-tech weaponry.
He argues that even in our technology-obsessed world, we can't ignore the effectiveness of simpler strategies.
Okay.
He uses the example of Palestine, where
Right.
resistance groups have been able to hold their own against Israel's vastly superior military, in part by using low-tech tactics and exploiting the vulnerabilities of high-tech systems.
So he's saying that even in the 21st century, David can still take on Goliath, even if Goliath has all the latest gadgets and gizmos.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that brute force doesn't always win the day.
Exactly. And I think it has important implications for how we think about power and security in the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about having the biggest guns or the most sophisticated algorithms.
Right.
Adaptability, resilience, and the ability to outmaneuver your opponent are crucial.
So maybe part of Plan B involves rethinking our obsession with technological superiority and recognizing the value of more unconventional approaches to conflict resolution?
That's a key insight. This constant drive for dominance can blind us to other possibilities, other ways of interacting with the world that don't rely on brute force or coercion.
This has been a really insightful discussion, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's definitely a lot more to unpack here.
So we've been having this fascinating discussion about the alpha male complex and how it relates to global power dynamics. Before we were talking about Plan B, this alternative approach to global relations that Mahfud proposes, one that moves beyond the constant pursuit of dominance.
Right.
But what might that actually look like in practice?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
And Mahfud doesn't offer any, simple solution, but he does offer some intriguing points that could, I think, guide us in a new direction.
Like his observation about the effectiveness of low-tech tactics against high-tech weaponry.
Exactly.
It seems counterintuitive in our technology-obsessed world.
Right.
You were elaborating on that before. Could you explain that a bit more?
Sure, yeah. So Mahfud uses this example of Palestine, where Palestinian resistance groups have been able to hold their own against Israel's much stronger military, partly by employing low-tech strategies and exploiting the vulnerabilities of high-tech systems.
Okay.
It highlights that technological superiority isn't always a guarantee of victory.
It's like he's saying that even in the 21st century, David can still challenge Goliath, even if Goliath has all the latest gadgets and gizmos.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think this has implications for how we think about power and security in the modern world.
Okay.
It's not just about having the biggest guns or the most sophisticated algorithms.
Right.
It's also about adaptability, resilience, and being able to outmaneuver your opponent.
So maybe part of Plan B involves rethinking our obsession with technological superiority and recognizing the value of more unconventional approaches.
Absolutely. And it goes back to Mahfud's critique of the alpha male complex.
Right.
This constant drive for dominance can make us blind to other possibilities, ways of interacting with the world that don't depend on brute force or coercion.
It's like we're so fixated on winning that we've forgotten how to play the game well, or even question if it's the right game to be playing in the first place.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And I think it captures the heart of Mahfud's message.
True.
We need to step back and reassess our assumptions about power, security, and global relations.
Right.
We need to move beyond the simplistic us versus them mentality and start looking for ways to build a more cooperative and sustainable future for everyone.
It's a tall order.
It is.
But a vital one.
It won't be easy.
Right.
But if we can break free from this alpha male complex and embrace a more collaborative approach to global affairs, we might just be able to avoid the catastrophic conflict that Mahfud warns us about.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, and I hope it's been the same for our listeners.
I hope so, too.
Mahfud's article raises some critical questions about the direction our world is headed.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically about the narratives we're being told and the choices we're making as a global community.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
from the history of colonization to the rise of AI-powered warfare.
Right.
But I think the most important takeaway is this. We have a choice. We can continue down this path of aggression and dominance, or we can choose a different path, one that leads toward cooperation, understanding, and a shared future for everyone.
It's a choice we all have the power to make.
Absolutely.
It starts with how we interact with each other, how we consume information, and how we engage with the world around us. So we want to leave you with this final thought. What kind of world do you want to live in? And what are you willing to do to make that world a reality?
We encourage you to reflect on these questions and to share your thoughts and ideas with others. The future isn't predetermined. It's a story that we're all writing together. It's up to us to decide what kind of story it will be.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.